Okay, so as I said, we're going to be focusing on reading and listening. And may I draw your attention that this event is mainly based on the 2016 specifications. But because we are looking at skills, the skills obviously will be applicable to any levels and the new specification as well. But there are aspects of listening and reading that are not going to be in the new spec anymore. So this training is based on the 2016 specifications. Okay, there will be more training for the new GCSE, but hopefully there's still going to be activities and strategies that you could use with the new GCSE as well, especially if you are still having, let's say, year 11 with the legacy GCSE, and then you've got the new cohort as well. Okay, so I mean, overall, the skills will be applicable to the new GCSE, but there are some aspects that are not going to be applicable to the new GCSE. Okay, so let's make a start on this training. So what are the other objectives of today? So today we're going to look at a range of practical strategies and activities. And this is mainly what this training is about acquiring strategies to help students with listening and reading. And I hope that you will be able to share your own expertise as well. There will be times during this session where I'm going to ask you to look at the resources I've just asked you to download and to think of questions or activities. So hopefully you will then see how practical we've tried to make this event. And we're going to look at strategies and activities to meet the needs of our students. And as I said, sharing good practice as well. So before we start, what I'd like you to answer is, you don't need to answer the 5 questions there, but just having your thoughts on listening and reading. So here are 5 questions in the chat. If you could just maybe share your thoughts on 1 or 2 about the challenge of listening and reading. And do you like teaching listening and reading? Do you think you've got enough time to do it? What do you find the most challenging, and why you have decided to attend this event? Okay, so I'll just give you a few moments to type in the chat. That'd be great. Thank you. So I've just seen the question of the 2024 spec. As I mentioned earlier, there are aspects in the new specification that have disappeared. So some of the ideas I'm going to talk about now may not be directly useful or applicable to the 2024 spec, but overall the skills and activities can be applied, but there are a few things in there that are not going to be relevant. Okay, so just to make that bear that in mind. Okay, but we are mainly concentrating on skills, but because, as you may have heard, listening and reading are slightly different in the new specification, things that we're going to do today may not be applicable. Okay. Thank you, Rachel. That feeling like a test yet? That's like a line I'm going to say later. It feels like a test. Thank you, Laura. Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Hopefully everybody can see everyone's comments as well. Okay, thanks. If you're still tapping in, that's fine. I can still see your messages, but I just want to move on. Okay, so let's move on. So before we look at activities and strategies, there is an understanding that we must have, but also students must have, is that understanding of levels of reading and listening. I mean, some of you may already be familiar with the different levels of reading and listening. But if you're not, hopefully something's going to help you with understanding how to help students to progress, but also how to teach. So there are different levels, or you know, yeah, I would say levels. We're not looking at level 1, level 2, level 3, but different layers into listening and reading. So they are usually referred as recall, process, and inference. Okay, so you may have already used them or you may have heard people say, "Oh, I need to do some recall question, or that's a process question, or that's an inference question." So that's what they're referring to. So I'm going to exemplify each one, and hopefully that would then help you understand what the different processes are. So the first one is the recall. So recall is where one item of vocab is going to be targeted. So here is like, do they know the word for? Okay, do they know that word? So that is the recall. It's like when we do a test, okay, we give them a vocab test, we give them 10 words, so can they recall the information? So recall of vocab. So for example, if obviously that would be the target language, if they are reading or listening with I went sailing last weekend, okay, so in French it would be Je suis allé faire de la voile le week-end dernier. So let's say they read that or they heard that. A recall question would be, what did they do last weekend? Okay, so that would be, because here it would be the main focus of that question will be, do they know that word? Okay, so what is it? So that's the first thing. So then we need to ask ourselves, okay, do we do that kind of listening and reading? Do we do listening and reading where we ask them to look at for particular words? And in an exam paper, there will be a mixture of recall, process, and inference, mainly at a foundation. As I said, I'm talking about the current GCSE, because the new GCSE, as you know, the inference question as such has been, well, they've have been removed, but I'll talk about this later. So in an exam paper, there will be some recall, some process, and mainly at foundation, but at higher, there will be more process and more inference. Okay, so that's because you could see there is an increase and a progress between the 3 levels. The next one is this, where they've got to process the information. They're going to hear different pieces of information, and then they've got to process that in order to answer the question. So here is again, that would be in a target language. Usually we go to Germany for Christmas, but this year we're going to stay at home. Okay, so here we have different information. We've got usually, and then we've got a place, and then a time, and then but this year we're going to stay at home. Okay, and I'm sure you know the types of question that may come up with that is, where are they going to spend their next Christmas? So here, obviously, if I listen to that, I say usually we go to Christmas. So here they've got to process it's not Germany, because Germany is usually, okay, but it's a home because they is going to be for, but this year we're going to stay at home. So here we've got a process. So they may hear 2 items that could be probable, but because there's something in the sentence that makes a difference, then they can't be. For example, here is the tense, because Germany and home could answer that question, but here the question is, where are they going to do? Because the usually is, why do usually, whereas next is Christmas. Okay, so here you could see. So I'm sure you've seen where sometimes you've got something like, I like this, but I don't like that, or my sister does this and I do that, or this is like this and this is like that, or I bought this but I didn't buy that. Where they have some kind of process to do, where they've got to process the tenses, the negative, the different people, the opinions, and so on. Okay, so it's not as straightforward. Now, if, let's say, my process question here stopped after Christmas, we usually go to Germany for Christmas. A recall question would be, where do they spend Christmas usually? So that would be to Germany, in Germany. Okay, but here, because it carries on, we're able to do a process question because we've got different things they've got to be aware of. And then the next level, okay, so you could see how it is different. The first one is straightforward, is item of vocab. The second one, I've got more in the sentence, more to process to get the main information out. Okay, and the next one is where it's going to be the inference. So the inference is where our students have to be a detective. They have to hunt for clues. They have to deduce the meaning from what they hear. That's what inference is. They've got to work out what the answer is from something they've heard. But in the something they've heard, the answer is not going to be straightforward. Okay, so here the question may be, what do they think of their holiday? Now, when I say, unfortunately, we only stayed for 1 week in Madrid, it doesn't really say what I thought of it, but we can infer this by the inclusion of unfortunately and only. So if I say unfortunately we only stayed, it means probably they really liked their holiday. They thought it was great, so they were so disappointed to leave. Okay, so here is the last inference. So, but as you may have heard in the new specification, this type of inference is not going to be present. The only inference that we will have in our Pearson and Excel papers where they've got to infer the meaning of one word. Okay, but still this can work out because they've got to look out for clues in the sentence to work out the meaning of a word. But in the legacy, so the paper that's going to be taken this summer, there will probably still be this kind of inference where they've got to work out. Okay, so here we've got the 3 levels. So hopefully it's clear. And then, there's something also you could share with your students to show them the different type of question. And also it's going to help them as well, because sometimes, especially when it's the inference, but miss, there's nothing in there telling me about what they think. I say, yeah, because this is an inference question. Okay, or miss, I thought they said they would spend it in Germany. Well, no, careful, because here you've got a lot of information to process, and here we've got 2 tenses. So where is where's the question asking you? Okay, so obviously in the papers that they will sit, it's not going to tell them this is a recall, this is a process, this is an inference. But if they are used to knowing that there are different types of questions, hopefully they will be prepared to work out, oh, I may have to listen to different tenses or negative or and so on. Okay. All right, so this follows on from taxonomies. Now, some of you in your schools, you may be using different taxonomies. So here I've got 2 taxonomies, and sometimes when, we sit in school trainings and then we look at these taxonomies and say, how can I apply that to languages? Okay, how do we apply these taxonomies in our lessons? That actually it does make sense here, because if I said to you the recall is, do I remember the word and do I understand? So that's where here the bottom of the pyramid is my recall questions. Now if you want them to move on, is where they're going to start to apply. So they've got to remember, they've got to understand, and they've got to apply. So apply is where they apply their grammar rules, like the past and the future, or the negatives, and where it is where my process question. Then they've got to kind of work it out. They've got to analyze. And then at the top of the pyramid is the inference, where obviously they have to remember the vocab. They've got to understand what they hear or read. They've got to apply their knowledge. They've got to analyze what's going on. And then they've got to evaluate something. So evaluation here, they've got to get some clues and then create an answer that is not actually in there. So that's how in our lessons we can show that we're using the different taxonomies, and then we can say, well, here we've got my recall, my process, and my inference. And you could see this is how we could also show how we make progress. So we need to ask ourselves, do we always spend time on recall? But also, do we work on process questions or inference questions? So that's what we're going to do later on, thinking about how we can do that in lessons. But hopefully here you could see that actually tallies with the taxonomies. The one at the bottom is not as common as the Bloom's taxonomy. It's called the solo taxonomy. So the solo taxonomy is the same, but it's kind of horizontal. Well, I mean, you can put it, vertical as well, but usually it's presented like this. But it's very visual, and you could see again the different stages in the recall, the process, and the inference. So I'm going to show you. Okay, okay. Okay, so I'm just going to use it. So here you could see that here, that means I know nothing. Okay, that dot here is I know nothing. So it's where obviously you don't have the vocab. So you do understand, so that would be that. Here is when I start learning, vocab. So first I learn pieces of information, I learn one vocab, and then I start here. The next stage is where you gather more vocab. So you've got your nouns, your adjectives, all that. So here, so that's kind of the recall. So therefore, in one recall question, I may be asked on one particular item of language. Okay, so again, the sailing. Do I know the word for sailing? That would be my retrieval here, my recall. Then the next stage here, you could see I've got all my knowledge, okay? But then my knowledge is linked. So here I'm going to process my knowledge, because if I know a noun, but if my noun, I've got plural, it may end in a different way. Or if I've got a negative. So here I put all my pieces of information together, and I can process the information. So that's the process thing. And the last one is I've got my knowledge. I know how things work together because I can link everything. But then from my understanding of everything, I can then create my answer. So that would be the top of the create there. So here, first of all, I know nothing. Then I remember things. I remember more and I understand. Then I'm going to apply the rules there that kind of link everything together. And then here, because I've got all my vocab, I know my rules, and then I can understand what's going on. And then because of that, I can create my answer and I can infer meaning. Okay, so hopefully you could see that the two taxonomies are the same. So what we need to ask ourselves in lessons is that, okay, first of all, where do I spend most of my time doing? Do I spend more time doing recall? Or do I spend a lot of time doing process? But if I do some process here, maybe with some students, I may do a bit of recall first, so therefore they can access this. Or if I do a lot of inference, have I done all this before with my students for them to access the inference questions? Because it's difficult to access the inference if they don't have the vocab. Okay, so therefore, what we need to ask ourselves before we do a listening or a reading, first of all, is where do I pitch my task? What is best for my students? And if I want to do a particular step, have I done something, if needed, before that to enable them to access? Have I provided stepping stones for that level? Okay, so here, if my listening was on recall, for example, maybe before that, I may do a quick brainstorm of vocab. So let's say about the sailing there, depending on my class, I may do a quick brainstorm of all the activities we may know. So that will hopefully help them with recalling the information, then be able to access the listening and the reading. If I do the process there, I may remind them, careful, sometimes you may hear a positive and negative opinion. So what can we hear if it's positive? What can we hear if it's negative? Okay, sometimes you may hear some past and future. Okay, if it's the past, what are we going to hear? If it's the future, what are we going to see? Okay, so therefore we're going to have that. For the inference, obviously we can't really, but we may say, okay, let's brainstorm some vocab, let's brainstorm some grammar, and because of all that, they'll be able to infer. Okay, so that's something we need to do as well. And also, depending on our students, we need to ask ourselves, are we providing the right level? For example, if I want to push my higher students to achieve, to score highly, where am I going to spend most of my time with the listening? Am I just doing, if I just do recall, that's not really going to help them with the process and in the inference. But sometimes we feel that actually, if they know the vocab, they can work it out. But some pupils may, but if you want most of them to succeed, we need to give them practice of process. They need to see what it is in reality. So it's not because they know the vocab that they'll be able to tackle this type of activity. So we need to give them examples of process, and we need to point out to them, careful here, watch out this, and then the more we do that, the more they'll be prepared for next time. So my top students, what do I do with them? Okay, so do I spend more time doing process and inference? Maybe. But my foundation students, I may do quite a lot of recall with them, and maybe do a bit of process as well. Okay, and inference maybe, okay, but not as much, because what they'll find in a foundation paper is going to be mainly here. Okay, so hopefully here is just trying to visualize activities. And in a moment, I'm going to show you different activities that are going to kind of analyze the type of questions they are, and then see how in lessons we can adapt our listening and reading to make sure we meet the need of our pupils. Okay, so something to remember, and some of you mentioned it earlier, that is not, sometimes it feels like it is a test, and that's why we need to do different activities with listening and reading. So, well, we will look at that later, but first of all, they've got to understand that comprehension is not a vocab test. Yeah, I may know my vocab, but if it's a recall, that's fine, but more likely it's going to be process, and then also there's going to be inference. So it's not like always because I know my vocab I'm going to be able to answer. Okay, because I need to be prepared for process question. I've got to be prepared for inference question. And also the vocab is very likely to be manipulated and surrounded by other words that may affect the meaning. So we look at that as well in a short while. So for example, yes, they may know the infinitives of verbs, but the likelihood of them seeing all the verbs in the infinitives is very, very little. They really have to know the verbs in different persons, but also different different tenses. So we need to work on that. So maybe when we ask them to do a vocab test on verbs, we'll say to them, okay, learn your verbs, okay, in the infinitive. I'm going to give you manipulated forms of that verb, and I would like you to find what verb it is. Okay, so we are then changing here. So yes, they recognize the infinitive, but they can recognize it as well when it's been manipulated. And especially very important if it is irregular verbs. Okay, or we could say to them, okay, learn these adjectives, but when I'm going to give them to you, okay, in the test, they are going to be in the masculine, they're going to be in the feminine, they're going to be in different cases if it's German. So they're going to be changed a little bit. But what you've got to do is you've got to recognize them. And also there's something we need to think about when we do vocab test. Do we always ask them to write in the target language, or do we also give them the target language for them to recognize? Because in listening and reading, they've got to react to what they read and hear. So sometimes we may do a test by just reading out some verbs and they've got to write down what they are, or reading out some adjectives. For vocab tests, as I said, we might give them the target language, and then it's how they're going to rework on their receptive skills, because listening and reading is about receptive. So can they recognize it? So again, here we need to have a mixture. So when we set a vocab test, we need to ask ourselves, what is this vocab going to help them with? Is it going to likely to help them with listening and reading, or is it going to be for writing and speaking? For instance, if we give them a list of jobs, okay, a list of, let's say, 20 jobs, is it more useful for them to recognize the jobs in the target language or to be able to say them in the target language? Well, actually, if they write about a job, they're probably going to use maybe a couple of jobs, the one they want to do, the one they don't want to do, and maybe what their parents do. So, but they would have practiced that. And even if on the day of the exam they write a completely different job, it doesn't really matter. Where understanding the job really matters is for the listening and the reading, because they've got to have a better range of vocab in there. So maybe we need to ask ourselves, when we give them vocab to learn, is it, are they going to likely to see them more in listening and reading, or to use it more in their writing or speaking? Okay, so something here to think about. And then we talked about unfamiliar language, that they need to be skillful in working out the meaning. And that is part, as I said to you just now, the new specification, they're going to have to infer the meaning of new words. So how do we infer meaning? We can look at the context. That's going to help us as well. Okay, so that's something here that we need to think about, and also to convey to our students that it's not a test, because it's comprehension. Okay, so they need to comprehend what's going on, not just about understanding, but comprehending. And then the vocab is likely to be manipulated and surrounded by other words, and that's why I want to go next. Okay, but these are little words, and I'm sure you've seen them before in texts that you've been practicing with in past papers. These are words that students need to be aware of. With my students, I have a list of little words. I know some of them are not little, but I call them the little words that we have our front of our folders, and then we regularly refer to them. So when we start a listening and reading activity, I say to them, okay, careful, look out for those little words. So is they're aware of them, because these little words are going to help them, and these little words are going to change the meaning of a sentence. Okay, because for example, in French, if they don't know the word of rien, nothing, okay, and then you say, je n'ai rien mangé. If they don't know the rien there, okay, and then, so what did I do yesterday? They can see manger. Oh, I ate. But I say it's rien, it's nothing. So I didn't eat anything, something like this. Okay, so they've got to know, oh, j'ai, and then the only have this, okay, or more something. So here we need to think of little words that are going to be useful. So in the group chat, I'd like you to think of little words, and maybe you say to them, careful, you got that wrong because you didn't notice that word, or careful, in this sentence there's this, so that's going to make an impact to the sentence. So in the group chat, can I ask you to write down other little words that you would add to this list? Okay, so I give you a few moments. Some of you may want make some notes as well. To if you there's some words you say, oh, I've never kind of said that to my students. Okay, so give you a few moments to type in other little words that you would add to these lists. Yes, we've got the sauf. Yeah, the sauf is that, par exemple, everybody was not except my boss. Okay, so obviously, then we've got to infer that the boss wasn't nice, or so there's something there. Yeah, the nini, the kind, and the klein. Yeah. Any other little word? The sans without, yeah. So I'm sure you've seen in a, that could have, I think it was in a sample assessment for the French, that was the from the 2016 spec, where it says, I came without any chocolate. Je suis venu sans chocolat. Okay, obviously, if they don't know the chocolate, so they can see I came, chocolate, oh, I came with chocolate, but actually it's without any chocolate. Yeah, in Spanish, the ya, but the ya no. Yeah. Any others in there? Okay, thank you. Any others? Un poco, un poco, yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm sure as you are going through other texts and so on, you will see them, but it's very important that aware of it because this will be part of the process because they've got to process. So, for example, if you have a sentence, as I said, everybody was not accept for the boss, and they will say, what was the boss like? If they don't know the source, they'll think, well, it was nice, but actually it's accept. So here there's something we need to work on with them. So when we do an activity, we'll look at, I'm going to give you later on a list of activities. The first thing we could ask them to do is to highlight any little words that they find. So before they start answering the question, say, first of all, look at the sentence, look at the text. Can you see any little words? Okay, or whatever you want to call. I mean, some of you might want to call them adverbs or negatives, but I've got a list where I could just put everything in, and I said these are little words. Okay, obviously I do say to them is a negative, is an adverb, but we call them the little words. Okay, so okay, so sorry, I'm just trying to. So hopefully you could see how these little words can be useful for that and how this can be used. Now I'm going to ask you to do another activity now. We're going to look at questions and we're going to ask ourselves, are there recall, are there process, or are there inference questions? So in your download pack, there is a document called Activity 2, and then there's your language there. So there's French, German, Spanish. So I'd like you to open it. So it looks like something like this, okay? Where you'll see you've got a lot of activities with numbers next to them. So what I would like you to do is to look at this document. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. Look at the document in the pack and ask yourself, so go through the different questions. So in a question, in actual task, you may have different like A, B, C. And one could be an inference, one could be a recall, one could be a process. So it's not because it's part of the same text, they're all going to be recall or process and so on. Okay. So what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to look at them. I think about 20 something in each of the languages, the language. So what I'd like you to do is to look at the one there and ask you, for example, here for number 9, okay, here in Spanish, is this one, okay, a recall, a process, or an inference question based on the text. Okay, just so that we get familiar with the different levels. Okay, so I give you about 5 minutes. So you might want to make some notes and go through with the, if you are in your department, you might want to do that together. So you don't need to send anything through the group chat. It's just for you to have a look, ask yourself, is it listening? Sorry, is it a recall? Is it a process or is it an inference? And if it is an inference, what can I do to help my students? If it's a process, where do you think I could point out my students to help them with that process? Okay, so just give you 5 minutes to do that. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So hopefully you've gone through some of them and you could see there are the different levels. So I'm just going to look at some of them. Okay, so if we look at, for instance, the French one here. So hopefully I'm going to translate anyway so that we could see there. So here, where will the festival be held this year? Now we could see here, last year the festival was in the south of France, but this year is going to be in the north. So you can see that's a process because if I start reading here, l'année dernière, so last year the festival was in the south of France. So students may think, oh, that's south of France because I've got where festival held. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to put south of France, but actually, have I processed everything? So I always say to students, if they think they've got the answer, have they really looked at the whole sentence? Because then we've got, but this year is going to be, so here, it's going to be in the north. So that's the process. Be there, okay. Again, we've got many groups. So I've got groups there. Okay, I've got 5. Okay, I've got 5 and 20. So we know there's going to be some kind of process. But if you said the festival started with 5 and now they're 20. So that's the process there. So, and then is the will be. The will be is important. So here, they've invited more than 20. So this year is going to be 20 or more than 20. Okay, so that's another process. And then, because not just about knowing our numbers here, but we've got 2 numbers. We have 5 and 20. So we've got to process this information and look at that. Here, it's not about, we don't, we're not just checking if we know our directions, okay, but we need to know also, do we know our tenses? And then here, what would the weather probably be like? Here is going to be an inference because it doesn't say here what's going to be like, but it says it's not always good weather in this region. So if it's not always good weather, it's likely to be bad weather. Okay, so that's the inference there. Now, if we look at some Spanish here, okay, so if you look at the last one here, for example, we have, so we got this person here. So we've got, oh, is there, okay. And then we've got, what do they play? So we've got 4 instruments. So here, if I look there, I've got there, and then I've got here, oh, I've got this instrument and they've got this instrument. So we know there's going to be a process. So therefore, I've got to say, okay, so is it now or is it, what is it? Okay, here it's guitar because the other instrument was was broken. Okay, so it was there. So here again we've got to think about the process. So if you look at the German one there, okay. For example, if you look at the 2 there, it's going to be process because we've got parents and teenagers. So here we've got, parents, and then we've got parents, and then so we've got to kind of process here this information. Okay. And then it says here what about teenagers. Okay, so again here, they've got to, is a process as well. Okay, so the different information in there. Okay, so hopefully, I said there are more in your packs. I'm not going to go through all of them, but hopefully you can see what, and here, for example, that's going to be a recall because here we have, there Saturday. So that do I know my days of the week? So therefore it's there. So it's not these others, okay, but it's this one. So that's a recall question. And usually the example is going to be a recall question, okay, because it's an example there. Okay, so hopefully you could see the different levels. So in one activity, in one task, here we've got the recall, but then you've got a process. And then here, so you can work out what these are as well. So there's something you could do with your department, something you could do with your students. Once you've kind of worked it out, we could say to them, okay, do you think that was a recall process? Why is it, what kind of information did you have to process to get that information? Okay, so it's more of a, then they can see why it is. And then some pupils say, oh, they're trying to trick us. It's not really a trick, but it's just showing that actually you've got a level. So you've got a different level. It's like when they play a game, in order to go to the next level, you've got to demonstrate that you can do that. Here is the same. My first level is, do I know this. My second level is, okay, I know this, but now I've got to put that into a bigger picture with the, uh, getting out the main information. And then the next level is the inference. So it's not a trick, it's just there to assess different levels. Okay, so hopefully that would help in terms of explaining, but also telling our students. Okay, so here, what I'd like you to do in this one, I guess we've got three texts. Okay, they're similar in meaning in the three languages. So what I'd like you to do, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, whether you can create, let's say, two questions per for your text. So can you maybe do like a recall and a process, or a process and an inference? So with the same text, can you create a recall question? Can you create a process? Can you create an inference question? Or as I say, just do two, pick two, for example, process and inference. Okay, so I give you 5 minutes, and maybe, and then what I ask you to do is to share in the group chat, for example, for French, what question, maybe write the questions in English, might be easier for everyone to understand. For Spanish, what would you write then? Is it a recall, a process, or an inference? I guess I give, and then I'll give you some examples as well in a moment. So give you a few moments here, have a little thing. So let's say you wanted to use that text and you wanted to create a recall question. What would you do? You had that text, but you wanted to do a process question. What question would you create? Okay, so I'll give you a few moments. And as I said, if you want to, you could share your questions in the group chat. That'd be nice to see. So you could just put French R for recall, and then what would you ask for questions? Thank you, Laura. Yep, these are great. Anyone else would like to share? So you could see the different layers of understanding in there. Okay, thank you. So some of you may be typing in or you might be still thinking about it. But yeah, so here we've got to do recall. So recall here, because a way straightforward where there's not a lot of process. For example, we could target, let's say, do they know adjectives, for example. So we could ask them, how do they find reading? Okay, they would say at the bottom, truly, or there. A question could be, do they know the vocab for mobile phone? Okay, so it could be uh, how do they spend how do the friends spend most of their time, their free time? So it would be on mobile and social networks. So that would be the recall where we are targeting particular vocab. Okay. What do they prefer to read? Obviously, we want to know whether they know comics or crime or what's the other one? Yeah, novels. Okay, so here we've got things like this. So here we're going to target particular vocab. Then the process is where we've got a little bit more to process. I mean, we could say who likes spending a lot of time because on the mobile, because we've got one person speaking and then it's got the friends, that could be a process because you've got a process actually is not the person writing, but actually all the friends. That could be one. Okay, there. And in terms of the inference, yeah, the one that you said, Laura, was good. What would they do if they wanted to relax? Well, they would read because that's what they said they find reading. So they don't say that, but that's the inference we could ask them. Or the inference would be, what do they think of social networks, but actually they don't really say what they say, but they say it's not their opinion, but what is not their opinion, that is a good way to relax. Okay, so here they've got some inference to do as well. So you could see here, this is how. Yeah, does the influence they like social media? No, because they say so they've got some process there. What do they prefer? Thank you, Lucy. Put them there. So here we could see that sometimes we may be given a text, and we'll look at that later on. We may be given a text because we've been using it for a while, or maybe it's in a textbook, and oh yes, I'd love to use that text, but then we look at the questions. Oh, these questions are not really for my students because maybe just recall or maybe it's just inference. So sometimes we may want, maybe if possible, because sometimes it's not possible because when the text is written for an exam, it's going to be written for a purpose because the principal examiner wants to get some recall questions in it, or they may want to write questions because they want some process. So sometimes if you use something from an exam, you may not be able to do some inference. You may not be able to because that task was not designed for it. Okay, the same with the textbook. The textbooks also follow that kind of layers in listening and reading. So if you find a text, you may not be able to create that, but sometimes you will be able to, at least 2 out of the 3 in there. Okay, but there's something here to bear in mind. But if let's say you had a text with a lot of process questions, we might want to, in order to provide stepping stones, we may want to produce some recall questions or do a brainstorm of activity or of vocab beforehand. But it's asking ourselves what is the level of the question there, and is it suitable for my students? If not, can I provide something before, or can you provide something extra? So therefore, everybody's happy, everybody can do something. Okay, so these are the kind of the thinking we need to have, when we tackle a listening or a reading. Okay, now In activity 4 now, again, we're looking at other things. So let's, as I said, you've got a track that you've used before, but this year you've got a different class and you think, oh, that's going to be too easy for or that's going to be too difficult. So here we're going to very similarly as what we've just done. So here you've got different transcript. Okay, so let me know, try to create, so here, I've just put one here, but you've got more on your in your document, something you could work on later on. But let's say you wanted to use the track here with that. What would you be able to do? Okay, would you be able to do some recall, process, and inference? So what would they be? So here we've got the first one for French, we've got here for Spanish, and you've got here for German. So can I just ask you, uh, just to look at your own one, French, German, Spanish, and what would you create? Let's say you were working with a French transcript. Would you create recall questions, process, or inference? So do you think that text could allow you to do some process or inference? Okay, so that would be good as well in the group chat, just to say French and then what question, then maybe put like a R, a P, or a I, whether it's an inference question. As I said, sometimes you may not be able to create inference because it was not designed for that, or recall. Or, I mean, usually recall it's fine. Process, but sometimes the inference that may not be there. Okay, so let's I think so. I'll give you about 5 minutes. So you've got transcript one here for French. It's also in your resources anyway, but you've got more. But if you just focus on the first one, that'd be great. And then you've got the German one there. Okay, so think of a few questions you could create, and would they be process, inference, or inference? Thank you. Okay, thank you. I can see some of you have written some questions in there. So do have a look at them. So it just gives you an idea, but it's something quite useful to do with our students is just sometimes just make up your own questions and just to say to them, okay, today we're going to work on process questions. So here are some questions I've made up myself. So let's answer them. Okay. Sometimes I do that with my students, but for more for reading, where I give them lots of sentences, and then I say, well, today I'm going to focus on processing information and little words. So here are some sentences. First of all, so they imagine they're taken from a text and they will be targeting the process skill. First of all, look out for little words and then answer the question. So you could create your own, so just to get them used to these different types of levels. So therefore they are not surprised on the day that to say, well, I didn't hear that. Yeah, but didn't because I was in inference. Or, but I heard different tenses, I heard different people. Yes, because I was a process. Okay, so they've got to get used to that. Okay, thank you. So I think some of you. So do feel free to read what your colleagues have written in there. But thank you for sharing your questions there. So hopefully you're finding this quite useful just to have the time to think about the different levels and also just to think how can I adapt my own lessons to that. So before we move on to the next section, I'd like you to have a little think about what we've just talked about and from that first section, what are you taking away from it? So are you taking away maybe the different levels, something maybe you were not, maybe you kind of knew about it, but you never really put a name to it? Or are you going to take away the actual mirror of the taxonomy, or could it be something that analyzing the type of questions? How do you think is going to impact on your teaching? So anything, just feel free to share your thoughts. At the end of this kind of part one in the group chat now, what are you thinking? Do you think, oh yeah, that's something I'd like to do, or that was useful, or I didn't know about it? So it'd be good just to have your reaction on part one. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Laura, that's true. Sometimes when we've got, we have this kind of whole school training and they talk about taxonomies, and usually in languages, we say, well, how can we apply that? But actually, it applies in listening, reading, it applies in grammar, it applies everywhere. It's just at different levels. We just have to put it back into context. But yeah, it's very useful. Once you know that, then you say, yeah, we do it in languages as well. This is how we do it. Okay, so then we can demonstrate that we use the taxonomies. Thank you. As I said, some of you may have already heard about kind of different levels, so that may may not be new to you, but hopefully you've had time to reflect and to think, actually, yeah, maybe I should do a bit more inference. I should do a bit more. But as I said, for the new spec, for Pearson and Excel papers, there's going to be more inferring of meaning. Okay, that's where the inference will be. Okay. I mean, I do use the name with my students. I say to them, okay, let's practice some process questions now, or like here are some inference questions, so they know the kind of process they're going to have to do in there. Let's do some recall question there, so they know, and at least they know what kind of attitude they have to have towards the question. So as I said, sometimes I just make up, let's say, 10 different sentences, but that would be part of process. So usually I put little words in there or sometimes I do that the inference, but at least they are getting used to it, and we give them the tools to it, especially looking out for the little words. That the first step is, okay, look out for little words in there. Can you find them? And then answer the question. Okay, thank you for sharing your thoughts there. If you're still typing in, that's fine. I can still see what's going on. Okay, thank you. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to spend there's just some time on classroom activities, but you could see how, I mean, what I've just said up until now, this could be changed into, so I've just had a noise. I don't know what that is. Anyway, we could use, so just to refer back to the taxonomies, is always asking ourselves, am I pitching my activities to the right level? And as some of you've thought about it, is okay, is this a okay, so I'm going to analyze my question in the, for example, if I'm using a textbook, and asking myself, is it a recall? If it's a recall, is it suitable for my, so is it going to be too easy for my, do my students need that? Maybe I've done too many recall questions with this topic. Maybe now I need to step up. So if I step up, do I go to process or do I go to inference? Vice versa. If I've got an inference question, is it going to be too difficult, or is it going to be achievable if I offer some stepping stones? So maybe I need to give them some vocab, and then we can infer. Or maybe together we can infer meaning. So it's just pitching, understanding where we are. And if we have those labels in mind, if we've got the taxonomies in mind, we know where we are, we know how we need to progress. And then we can see how we can help our students make progress in listening and reading, because then maybe next lesson, we're going to step up a bit, we're going to give them process. And then the next one, we're going to be give them inference questions. Okay, so hopefully there to work out. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do, um, in your pack, you have a document called Activity 5, which is reading and listening activities. It looks like this. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, I'm going to give you a few moments just to read through them. You'll see they are very similar, because reading and listening, actually, we're doing the same. It's just sometimes instead of listen, it's just read. But most of the time, we could do the same activities. What I'd like you to do is to read them and ask them, what activities do you use with your students to help them with reading and listening from that list? And then, is there anyone from that list that you would like to use? And then I'm going to go through that list with you just to exemplify what we could do. So it looks like this, okay? It should be up to 17, but it didn't come through on my page there. So you could see here is not the usual activities, but here there are strategies to help them with their listening and reading skills. So if you cannot access it on your screen, you've got one side of it, okay, from reading, but listening will be very similar. Okay, so have a little think about what you already do with your students and what else you think in there you can use, and then we're going to discuss that. Thank you. Okay, hopefully you've had time to read through these, okay, and have a little think about what you do or don't do already. Now, what we need to think about is what we want to do with the listening and the reading, whether the track or the text we're doing. Is it a test? Do we want to assess their comprehension skills, or do we want to help them? Do we want to train them? Do we want to train their ears? Do we want to help them with comprehension? So there are two different things. If we want to do a test, well, we just play and, if we go, okay. But if you want to help them with skills, then we need to do other types of activities because some of you, as you mentioned, it feels like a test because we say, okay, listen, here are some questions. And for a lot of students, that is, oh, that's a test. I'm not going to do it. I don't understand. And I give up. Okay. So sometimes we've got to rethink the way we present listening and reading comprehension. It doesn't need to be like a text and question. It doesn't be like a track and question. It could just be, here is a text. Okay, first of all, and we may do the questions later on, but that's not the aim. The aim is the skills that we're going to help them acquire. So for example, we could say to them, okay, first of all, because your students may need a lot of recall, okay, find the words for. Okay, so here are words in English. Can you look for the words? So here we are practicing the recall. And this probably is going to help them with maybe a process question later, or the recall question, or the inference question. So we just do stepping stones. Okay, we say to them, don't worry. Okay, there's no comprehension question. We're just playing around with the text. Okay, or we could say, could you find the conjugated form for these verbs? So you give them the verbs in the infinitive, and they've got to find the conjugated forms. So here we say to them, we are practicing your skills. See if you can recognize. We could ask them, okay, can you make a list of all the verbs, or here, because if you look at the back of that sheet on in your document is for listening as well. Make a list of all the verbs in the future tense that you can find or you can hear. Okay, so off you go. So you could see it's not daunting, it's not as daunting as here's a text, here are the questions. Because here what we're doing, we are give them tools for later on to help them with maybe the questions we want to do them. So we could spend maybe one lesson doing different activities or maybe part of it, and then we give them the questions. But the activities that we're going to choose from this list here are going to help them with answering the questions. So you could see here, the 1 to 17 or 18, they follow the taxonomy. The first here, we could see the first activity are recall. And then we go into the process because we asked him to find a synonym. We asked him to do like a paraphrase to find, okay, negative, what are the next two? Okay. And then we asked him to look around a little bit more. Okay. And then when you look at the kind of 12, 13 is more the inference. How do we know? So here's something, okay, I'm going to ask you, how do we know, if you refer back to, how do we know the parents are strict? How do we know they like their holidays? How do we know this? Okay, so here we're getting them into the inference. Okay, do you think it was bad or a good experience? Why? So even if it's not a question, we could ask that. Okay, how are they feeling about whatever their parents? How are they feeling about the school? Okay, and why? And so on. So here you can see these are different type of activities that we can use to help students with their skills. So here is not, the aim is not getting 5 out of 5 in the question, but the aim is to acquire the skills that hopefully would help them, give them the tools here that's going to help them later on with a question. Okay, so here we've got a different thing, but also this could help you if let's say we have a text and you think, oh, what can I do to help them with accessing the text? So we could say, well, I'm going to look maybe 1 to 5 here, and maybe I could ask them to find the word. So that could be a stepping stone, like a first activity. Okay, and then you've got the questions that you want to do. Or you look at the question, you think, oh, these are all kind of recall questions. is there any, maybe I could add maybe two other questions. That could be inference. Maybe we look at 12 to 16. Maybe I could ask, how do we know something? Was it a bad or good experience? So that could be something you just tag on, just to give that breadth and maybe to give that differentiation into your task. Okay, so here, what I'd like you to do in the group chat, is there maybe one or two particular activities in there you would like to use with your students? Which one do you think, oh, that's a good one. I'd like to use that one next time. So have a little think. As I say, it could be for listening and reading. Instead of read is kind of listen. Okay. So give you a few moments in the group chat if you could let me know which one you or which ones you like in this list of activity. Yeah, the one about paraphrasing is quite good because sometimes in the question it could be something was not cheap. So it was a different way of saying cheap, not cheap. It was expensive. That could be something in the question. So sometimes they've got to go beyond. How can differently I can say, can I use synonyms or paraphrase there to help them with that? So that would be a good way of that. So if you know that particular phrases or sentences are targeted in the question, we could ask them, can you paraphrase that? Could you find a synonym for that? Yeah, with the time expressions as well. Look at the tense because we're going to see the endings, but also the time phrases as well. Okay, so basically, there is just to help them access first of all and then how cope with the questions. Okay, so you can see here, there's plenty there that you can use. So maybe as a target, you could say, well, next time I'm going to use, somebody's raised their hands. Um, so if next time you do an activity like a listening or reading, you could say, well, I'm going to try that one. So maybe as a department, there could be targets you set yourselves, and let's see if you could try to use some of these activities for the strategies for listening and reading. Okay. Because as I said, there's plenty there for you to think about and try out with your students. Okay, thank you. So the next one, as I said to you, it's quite practical, this training. We look at things and we kind of think about. There's a textbook page in your pack. And then again, asking ourselves, if I see that text in the textbook, okay, is it suitable for my class and what else can I do? So for example, here, so you've got these ones there. So you've got the French, you've got the German. So for the French one here, I've got the question that first of all, I need to ask myself, is it a process, inference, or recall? And then if I look at the text, what can I do with my, or, can I keep some of them? Can I maybe add more before? Can I maybe ask, can I just put some more in there just so that students feel they can do something in there? So I'll just give you a few moments just to look at the ones in your packs and see what you would do with these ones, because obviously textbooks what they do, they offer different levels, as I explained to you, but sometimes you may use a text that is not at the right level for your students at the time you want to use them. So we've got to be kind of reflective on that. Okay, so let's just give you a few moments just to have a look and see what you would do with that particular text. So you've got the German there. Oh, I thought it was Spanish. There's a Spanish as well in your pack. It's just not there. Just have a think of yours, what you would say. Yeah, just give you another minute just and then I'm going to maybe go through this one and see what we could do with this one here. Okay, I just want to go through this one. So here you could see we've got four things, but then if we look in the text, we could see straight away that we've got kind of the four things mentioned there. Okay, so we therefore think probably it's going to be a process question, this one, because we've got les voyages there and we have voyager. We've got horaire and then we've got horaire. We've got les gens. I think there's something about le contact avec les clients and then you've got le salaire there. There's something there about I think the salaire is a bit later on. So here we're probably going to be, okay, a process, especially if we've got that le mieux there. So that is going to be tricky. So here, we know there's going to be there. So what we could ask our students to do here, first of all, is to look out for little words, okay? So the little words there, we will have surtout, okay, especially, okay? And then we've got le plus, which is the most, okay? And then we have très, which is very long, okay, and then we've got donc, c'est. So here they kind of worked out, first of all, I've got all that. And then we might want to do some recall question about, or maybe some vocab, ask them to look out for particular words, either stimulating or the inconvenience. So first of all, we might look for particular words, then we'll ask them to do some, so look out for little words. And now, so what's the best? Okay, so the best hope is, especially if we like traveling, but the thing that I like the most, so we know it's going to be the most there, is the contact with the clients. So it can't be there or this one because it says here is the best. So here is the process they need to have. So first of all, as I said, we may do a bit of vocab in there. And then secondly, ask them to do some looking out for little words. And then with all that, we say, now, what do you think it is? Okay, and then we'll do the same for this one. So you could see here there's kind of stepping stones that we need to do and things we could do to help them. So hopefully once we've gone over the recall, look at the vocab, then we ask them for little words and that hopefully they should be able to answer the question. Okay. All right. So that's kind of where I just want to just do that, as I said, just to have a little, just to be a little bit, just to think about what we ask our students to do with the textbook and also how we use it ourselves. So just to finish off, I just want to kind of go back a little bit on and just again something we could think about is what are we helping our students to do? Are we going to ask them to for the skills or exam techniques? So as I said to you, are we helping them with achieving that 5 out of 5, or are we practicing the skills? So here are things we could do in lessons. So if we are practicing the skills, maybe we forget about the questions and then we just exploit the text and the list and the transcript as per the activities I gave you earlier. We may use the reading and listening as a springboard for other skills. Okay, so once we've done a listening or reading, we could use that for maybe writing. Once we've gone over that, we could ask them to do some vocab work with that. We could do that to move up levels. And as I said, the focus is not answering questions. So basically, we play around. We play around. We're looking at the skills that we want them to have. And the second one, the second part of it that obviously we need to help them with is the exam techniques. So how to approach the question. Maybe not the whole text can be used, but then, okay, what skills are you going to need? So looking out for little words, looking out for tenses, understanding endings and understanding particular sounds, understanding the difference between, I don't know, if in German, schön and schon, all that kind of thing is going to help them. We're going to focus on the question. So we're going to really look at the question in detail. So for example, here, if I've got this one here, whether she like the best in her work. It's not what she likes, but it's the best. So the best is going to make a difference. Here is what would she do before. Here we've got the new, okay, and then again was. And then we've got the more and the worse and the more, oh, sorry, the less there. So here we really look at the question and we dissect that question because that question is going to be useful. And then we help them understand the expectations or demands of questions. Obviously, they won't know which one is which in the exam, but hopefully, if we've exposed them to quite a range of recall, process, and inference, they will be able to tackle this and how to tackle a longer text, how to tackle a track. Okay, there. Okay, so just to finish off, there are some questions I'll ask you now, and it'd be lovely to have your thoughts in the group chat. So, how is today's training going to impact on your teaching? What are the key points you're taking away, and which 2 activities would you like to try with your next classes? Okay, so I'll give you a few moments in the group chat. That'd be lovely to see what what you're taking away from this training. Okay, thank you. Give you a few moments to type in. Thank you, Lloyd. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for that. And I'm glad to see that some of the activities and strategies are going to be useful. And as I said, sometimes just a little bit of tweaking of what we do or things we've been doing that's going to really help. But it's just about the thinking about where we pitch our listening and reading tasks and having the taxonomies or just the kind of the recall process and inference at the back of our mind. I mean, I know it's helped me throughout my teaching years, having kind of the taxonomies. Where am I putting the activities? Is it recalling? Is it process? Or is it, as I said, it could be applied to different aspects of languages. But in listening, reading, especially sometimes we're not really sure how we can help our students progress. But obviously, it's by providing them with different levels. That is one way. Obviously, the vocab is important. That's why doing a lot of recall maybe before listening and reading could be also useful, because then we are making sure they know the vocab, because without the vocab it's difficult for them to access. So vocab work is essential. We've got to do a lot of vocab work on that. So the vocab, as I said, you could be manipulated, it could be tests, it could be looking at different forms of a particular, but we need to do a lot of the vocab. Without the vocab, they cannot access the. I mean, it sounds obvious, but they may have the skills to do it, but if they don't have the vocab, well, they don't have it. So something to think about how we exploit the vocab. And as I said earlier, when we ask them to learn vocab, we need to ask ourselves, is the vocab going to be more useful for receptive skills like listening and reading, or for productive reading? So not all vocab tests should be from English to the target language, but we could give them the target and then can you recognize those words? Okay, because that's going to be more useful in the listening skills and reading skills. Okay, thank you for that. So just to finish off, just a few slides from us. Remember that we've got a lot of free support for this legacy. Legacies of 2016, but also for the new one. But as I said, this training was more targeted to the legacy one. But hopefully you could see how you can use that for the new GCSE as well. So we've got plenty of activities. So if you go on our website for language, and you could see here there's about 100 documents here, teaching and learning. So you've got different things there. And if you go into the past training, you should be able to find the documents from today's session. So here, I can't click on it, but if you go on our website, you will see. So if you go here, you go to teaching and learning, and then you have a drop down, you can expand that all as well. And then if you go to here, the past training content, because we've done this training before, you should be able to access the documents. I know some of you've because you're on your phone, you haven't been able to access the documents or download them. But if you go there, you should be able to access them. Okay. And then our subject advisor, Rebecca, is there to support you. So any questions you may have, make sure you contact her. She's your first port of call. So any questions, whether it's about GCSE A level, the new spec, the legacy spec, we're here to support you. And remember that if you need an EPICLE training, we could come to your center. We offer a range of support. So have a look at the academy where you found this training, but also there are others. But if you've got a particular, or if you want one of us to come to see you, you could request that through the PDA as well, where you would find a request for center visit. Okay, so that is all from me for this evening. So I'd like to thank you for listening to me for the last, I think, nearly an hour and 45 minutes. I hope you're still awake. I hope you're still listening to me. Hopefully you will take away some activities from today, and I hope to be speaking to you very soon again, or maybe seeing you face to face. So from me and from Everyone at Pearson, I'd like to thank you. Have a lovely evening and all the best for your current GCSE and for the new GCSE if you're teaching the new GCSE as well. So well done and thank you and have a lovely evening, everyone.